Good morning. It is a beautiful day. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us. I am your host, Jon Cox, and this is the Core Keyword Podcast, episode number 3. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary friends, on today's episode, we are bringing the metaphorical train that is this podcast into the station of Value Town as we finally get to start doing the content that we are here to do. Today, we are going to be taking a look at the player pack for Midwest Conquest. Midwest Conquest is a grand tournament that is in Independence, Missouri on May 26th through the 28th. And we're going to be going through that piece by piece, taking a top-down look at the general trends, and then we're going to go through mission by mission, talk about it, what it means for your army, what it means with relation to the meta, and just walk you through the process of how we prepare for an event. In Touching Grass with Ben, Ben is going to talk to us about some low-impact exercises to help you through your day. And then finally, when we come back in part 3, we're going to talk about player-placed terrain and how you adapt to that if it's your first time seeing it. Because for a lot of us, it very well might be. It's not something very common around here. On the panel with me today, as always, is the editor, Don Plumlee, the captain of the Hogs of War, Daddy Smurf himself, Howard Watts, and joining us this evening, a couple of special guests. The Beet Juice Bandit, he is fleet of feet, Ben Ledbetter, and a man so nice you won't notice the 3 drop pods that are in your deployment zone, Bryce Watson. Let's get started. Hey guys, how we doing?
What up?
Solid.
Doing well.
Only 3
Always
drop
good,
pods?
buddy.
Rookie numbers.
It is a dedicated transport. You could take more. I just couldn't figure out more that I wanted to put in them.
Yeah, I've never taken a drop pod in my life, so I have no idea anything about them.
It's great until someone touches it.
Okay, so Midwest Conquest, fellas. From the top down, 5 missions, 2 days, right? The major thing that I'm noticing here is that all 5 of the maps do have a central objective. How do we think that that's generally going to play out in relation to the armies that you play?
Oh, I was going to say the another big thing about it is that all of them are, I mean, I guess maybe they're all 5 token or like 5 objective missions instead of 6, and so for a lot of like Marine armies or like elite armies, that's not going to be as big of a deal. And me as a Votann player, it's pretty nice that I don't have to worry about spreading out across the map. It's just 1-2 more, so I'm probably guaranteed at least 4 points around. So I'm really liking that.
How many models has Games Workshop told you you're allowed to play with, Ben?
I actually have a surprising amount, simply because I changed my list. But I think I have a total of 28 or 32. I think. A total of 11 individual units, most of them being 4 models or less.
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Does not compute.
How's it feel to have less units on the table than Monster Mash Tyranids?
It feels pretty bad sometimes, honestly, but it's fine. We're getting used to it. I'm trying out a Thunderkin spam this time with the Forge Master to buff him up, so we're going to see how that goes.
Ben's out here playing in a hard mode.
Yeah, purposeful, no land fortress. Not because I don't own one, but because out of principle I decided I didn't want to use one.
Fair enough.
I can dig it.
Yeah, I'm kind of funny you're taking a land fortress out. I'm kind of leaning into the opposite direction where I'm actually looking to add tanks to my list.
Are you now?
And what are you currently running, Bryce?
So I'm on the Iron Hands train. I went in the effort to paint my Marines in a chapter neutral scheme because I'm gonna just jump like a dirty meta hopper. And looking at the mission pack and what the missions are, I feel very rewarded in that decision, given that it is all the missions have a central objective. They're all hold 1, hold 2, hold more, and it's a player-placed event. I feel very rewarded in my meta chasery.
Some of us have been doing this a while and are just we're being paid for our patience.
Not all of us are at Famous Ward.
Whatever. I am actually very happy that there are 5 missions. So much, in fact, that it has greatly influenced my list decision choices. So, it Oath of Moment's just going to be great. Like every Marine player is just going to like love it. 5 missions, all central objective. Oath of Moment's an auto take as a secondary choice. That's just a given. For anybody listening to this that doesn't play Marines, understand that your opponent is going to have a solid in pocket 10 to 12 on the low end secondaries. So you need to take that into account for your list planning.
Yeah, I agree. The funnest part of the Marine v Marine matchup is when you both take Oath and you go for that roll off and you're hoping to go second because you want that easy Oath score and you want to stop your opponent from getting it.
That's exactly right.
So do you think that the player placed is going to have really any impact on Oath, depending on who gets to place that first piece of terrain, if they stick that rune on the middle?
So I can only speak for myself to answer this part. So the way that I've built my Iron Hands list is I have a bunch of nonsense to go and sit on an objective from the middle. So I've got a bunch of Landspeeder-esque units, something less than 100 points, but it's quick, it'll get on there. Because the way that Iron Hands score Oath of Moment, it's not get on an objective and hold it, it's put something dumb on the objective to hold it after my shooting clears something off of there. And then it's just kind of rinse and repeat that. So player plays kind of helps that a lot, where if I get the first drop, I can kind of ensure, I'll take the crates that you give, I'm going to put them right in the home objective, and I'm just going to all right, you put stuff there if you feel like it.
Oh, in the end part of this episode, we are going to have a fun talk about crates, because there is some spicy stuff in here that's crate tech. Anyway, so the first mission. Let's take a peek at that. Right, the first mission of the pack is
tear down their icons.
That's right. We're playing bombs, baby.
It's a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, I think everybody enjoys
really
bombs.
Enjoy tear down their icons.
I say that with this current. Well, actually, you can play bombs with any unit, right? It doesn't even have to be like infantry.
Yep. Anything.
Yeah. You only get a benefit as far as like immediately priming and or getting the plus whatever it is 3 if their objective secured. So any unit.
Cool.
So bombs tends to be one of those missions that scores primary pretty well as a rule, and it tends to devolve into just like murder and bloodshed in the late game, even if it starts out a little bit slow. So do we feel like secondaries are going to be more important on bombs, or how do we think bombs are going to play in the current meta?
So I am going to actually play the devil's advocate here. I think tear down their icons in this pack is one of the more difficult missions for some armies to play primary. And I say that because you have to have a couple of things, right, to effectively kind of get the jump on bombs as far as getting the extra 4 points per bomb being primed. So you can start on the midline, right, like whether that be in the bottom or the top, depending on what player or what deployment zone you're in. And of course, you can just walk across that line and prime a bomb, okay? If you go first, right? So I think if an army either has faster units or has 4 deploy options, or like I know Bryce is probably running a storm speeder with scouts, right? Like zip up, get out, plant a bomb. It doesn't prime immediately, but if your opponent doesn't have an asset to go get there, it's going to prime. And one specific thing about bombs as a mission, you can only plant 1 and you can only defuse 1 per battle round, right? So you eventually get to a critical mass where my opponent has 3 bombs planted and it's round 4, I can only defuse 2, and that's if you can get there. And if I believe there aren't enemy units within range. If there's a couple other restrictions, so if you have 4 deploy units, right, that's going to immediately give you a plus. Regardless if it primes immediately, it still gives you the option, right? A speeder, and that kind of Bryce hinted on that, like a 50-point land speeder storm can plant a bomb that might influence the game later on in the mission. My point is, if you don't have units like that, or as an opponent, if you go first and you can go, cool, he deployed this here, I'm gonna make X decision to influence that person's ability to drop a bomb. Or if your opponent it doesn't have speed or doesn't have those other options, like you are really, really handicapped. And on hold 1, hold 2, that's all fine and great. If you don't have those 4 deploy options, you're only starting round 2 on a 4, unless you like advance and lose the shooting, or so as a baseline, like 32 is what you might get, unless their plan is to dive the middle and go for 12s.
Yeah, I was going to say I have some math for it. It's if you finish with 0 primed explosives and control 2 objectives the whole game, you're scoring 32. If you manage to hold 3 objectives for 2 of those 4, you're earning 40. So you really do have to lean into the bombs directly if you're wanting to score without having to worry about holding 3. And so for me, as a more elite army, I kind of have to do. I mean, honestly, you kind of have to mix for both. Obviously, be planting bombs when you can. In my previous list, I had a action and shoot, relic within 6 inches of one of my calls. I took that out for a Forge Master simply because he can be actioning. And so I used to like tear down their icons because my bikes could be bombing and shooting. And it was nasty because I'm not losing out on like a 140 point unit or whatever it is, not doing anything. But now with my new list, I'm a little bit more nervous about tear down their icons just because I have to work so much harder to score when it comes specifically to the bomb. So I'm interested to see how the rest of it pans out. But I've got my Sagittars that can do work once I drop off my Zerkers in the center or wherever they're going to go. But yeah, it's a little bit more difficult than I would have liked previously.
So I just want to chime in for a second, and that I've really enjoyed Tear Down Your Icons because of its interaction with like behind enemy lines. And oftentimes you're dropping a trash unit in for behind enemy lines, right? You're like, oh, this is some garbage that's going to die next turn. If you can plant bombs with that, all of a sudden you're getting double value, and that's huge in my world.
Yeah, one of the things that I enjoy about this mission, despite being introduced as somebody who runs 3 drop pods, I find that as a player, I typically tend to be a little bit more passive in my game plan. I very much like the play of I'm going to control my side of the board and score my points. You can come try and stop me if you want. And where I find with bombs you can do that is you can actually kind of afford to seed early turn primaries if you can recover it with bombs on like turns 3 or 4. And I've had games before where by kind of not sticking as many stuff out, but having people have to come out and take objectives with things like Ward said, like speeders, scouts, forward deploy stuff, things that they're going to have to commit things to go in. Suddenly, like if you take up a 4 or an 8, or you just take a low primary score turns 2 and 3, but your opponent has to stick a bunch of their stuff out to try and stop that.
Yeah, bombs is a solid mission. It rewards it like exactly like Bryce says. It rewards a decision point. Like you may not be advantaged in the first or second round, or maybe even third round of a mission, but you might be able to keep it close, right? And then that 8 points on bombs 4 and 5. I mean, that's an extra turn of primary holding 2 missions or holding 2 objectives. And I mean, at Felice Exterminatus in December in round 5, I thought I had lost the game because I was ahead in the mission, playing Connor Johnson, great guy, really good Thousand Sons player. And he was like, wait a second, I'll just move this guy over here and plant a bomb. And I'm like, oh, I did not account for that 4 points. I ended up winning by a single point, but it could have just as easily been either a tie or a 1 point win in his favor because it's easy to forget about it. Like, oh, okay, well, I think I got this by 4 or 5 points. Oh, and then a bomb gets planted. So, but
Yeah, and this is one where I think later on when we talk about player place, it'll be important to like look at where you're setting up your terrain in order to safely be planting bombs and not just throwing a trash unit away if you are like an elite army. Like Bryce, you've built it into your list that you can do this with stuff. I, on the other hand, can't really sacrifice one unit just to plant a bomb and die. And so making sure that I set up myself for success at the start of terrain placement really is going to be key in this one.
I also kind of just want to chime into kind of what you were saying, Ward, and that you're not accounting for these points on the bomb, right? And you can have an 8-point swing in your favor at the end of round 4 and 5 by planting a couple of these bombs. Similarly, you can increase that swing if you remember that the bombs exist and you sacrifice or set aside a unit to go disarm the enemy bombs, right? How many games have you been in where you've got 2 bombs in an easily disarmable place and somebody just leaves their unit on their home deployment zone and doesn't disarm it?
Bro, I didn't even think about that. With my Forge Master, like he's able to be actioning and I can be using him as a diffuser. Man. Don?
Well, it's I was gonna say it's harder, right? Because if you don't have objective secured, you can perform the action to disarm the bomb, but it only goes off. It only disarms on a 4-up unless you're using something with OBSEC to do it.
And I was just making sure because I've done this before. I'm fairly certain that you can do it. And I was just bumping it with the mission pack. So, one, you have to deploy it in the opponent's territory. That's a given. And it has to be wholly within 3 inches of the unit. Okay, it's not the model, right? So you can drop a bomb, model, move 6 inches or whatever your movement characteristic is. It's the more movement, the less it matters. And then prime the next explosive in the next turn 3 inches on the other side of that unit, and they are 9 inches apart. So that one unit has dropped an explosive, dropped another explosive, and like that means if you have a trash unit that your opponent now has to go answer, or it's 4 points and 4 more and 4 more. So bombs can be very, very high scoring on primary, but as an opponent, I feel you can actively limit that as an option. And it rewards player skill, which is a good mission set.
Before we move on to the next one, I just want to touch that the bombs the bombs also can act as a diversion, right? Like you're always looking at ways to cause disruption for your opponent's game plan. You plant a couple bombs and either they ignore them and you get the free 8 points, or they have to disrupt their game plan to come back and deal with them. So I really like the Tear Down Your Icons mission. It's among my favorites of the mission.
To put a nice little bow on all of this talk about bombs here, the baseline of 8 points per turn on primary looks to be like it's going to be very safe with the way player placed terrain sets up, with it being in your half of the board, so you should be able to very safely position your terrain to where you're getting those 8s unless somebody comes to contest through your obscuring terrain. So those bombs at 4 points apiece are going to be a larger percentage of the available points left at the end of the mission that you can pick up. The next mission in the pack is Abandoned Sanctuaries, mission number 21, everybody's favorite, or at least Don's favorite.
From a mission we all collectively agreed is pretty good to Abandoned Sanctuaries.
Listen, Don loves this map.
This is my second favorite mission.
Yeah.
This is great. I don't get any of these things that they take away. They're like, hey, you can't forward deploy, you can't pregame move, you can't do this, you can't do that. And I'm like, oh, I'm Tyrannus, I don't get that anyways. This is pretty dope. High five, guys. Even playing ground.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that Abandoned Sanctuaries, as a rule, if you're not familiar, does not let you do all of the forward deploy shenanigans. The current iteration says that you cannot deploy a unit in no man's land. Now, to point out, it does not say you cannot deploy a unit on turn 1 in your enemy's deployment zone. So be sure to screen that nonsense, or Bryce will come for you with his drop pods.
And have done.
And have done.
Yeah, that's a big head scratcher when they're like, "But you can't come in no man's land." I'm like, "I'm in your deployment zone, buddy."
So I have a story about this very quickly because we were playing in an RTT and I was playing against a person who was on Space Wolves and he had just brought out his 10 Desolation Marine squad, the new hotness, perched up behind a ruin, and he didn't screen the drop pod. So I dropped the drop pod, turn 1 in the middle of his deployment zone on his backfield, and he never got a chance to fire those Desolation Marines, because turns out 20 plus grab shots just picks you up.
You be dead.
It was not good for him.
I think we're all going to not be weeping any tears for the Desolation Marines. I don't know. I just have a feeling that we're all already sick of that nonsense. Anyway. So how do we honestly feel about Abandoned Sanctuaries and its position in this pack? Abandoned Sanctuaries tends to be a very passive start to a game. It has that one in the center there. Ward is shaking his head no at me. You know?
All gas, no brakes, baby.
Well, we know how you play, right? But generally, because of the positioning requirements of Abandoned Sanctuaries, it's long edge deployment. You start a good ways apart. You know, it takes a little bit of time for the action to actually kick off. So you have less time, right? Time is the resource that you are limited on in this one because it's going to take you an extra turn to get into position to actually be able to affect the board state a lot of the times. So you're likely not going to be getting an early 8. You're likely going to be getting an early 4 and then have to go from there.
So the direction I went with list building, right, which is kind of what we were joking about before we started, nothing is durable in 9th, right? However, you can create, I always call it in list building like the middle package, right? Like you have your elements that, aside from it being abandoned sanctuaries, can deploy on the flanks, or can have the speed to go around the flanks, or can come in from reserves, which matters in every other mission pack every other objective except for abandoned sanctuaries as a mission. So this mission rewards durability, or as much of it as you can get. So this I see as a kind of in conjunction with it being player places, you are really going to want to either go first or go second, and I'll give my reasons why. So I've always seen the first turn in any game more as, sure, if you can get an alpha strike and you can limit what's going to shoot back at you or fight you, like that, obviously that has its advantages. But if you can gain real estate on multiple fronts, that is going to be beneficial. If you can be the first person to the middle, if you can be the first person to leverage where you placed your terrain with whatever game plan you have for your secondaries and for your army as far as primary scoring, you're going to be the first one there. You're going to be able to influence then that person's primary scoring going second, right? And going second, right, you get to then make the decision where you're going to counterpunch, where you're going to move those units. So this mission, I feel, will reward proper player placement or terrain placement, in addition to having something in your list that's built for durability, or that you can just throw out on an objective that's cheap. It's like, well, you got to shoot this, or I score more points. And if you can utilize dense or any other terrain that you may have to your advantage, like it's going to be beneficial. So TLDR, a good durable package for the middle that is has some duality in shooting and in melee aggressors.
So what is a durable package then? Because look at my list. Nothing I have is specifically durable, but I kind of build into it through. I try and activation gate it. So, for instance, someone mentioned before, I'm running scouts in a land speeder storm. You need at least 2 activations to wipe that off an objective, right? Because you got to kill the transport, then you got to kill the guys that get outside. And if you leverage that correctly with player placed, I really started getting in competitively with Drukhari, so this is near and dear to my heart, but you can place a transport to where they will 100% kill the transport, but the stuff you care about, the guys inside, get out safely. So, like, to me, that's a durable package, not because it's going to roll dice well, but because it's going to take annoying things for my opponent to deal with. What is durable to you?
I am going to interrupt here for a second and ask Bryce to clarify for everyone who has not been privy to all these conversations that we've had what he means by activation gate.
So what I mean when I say activation gate, so scouts in a land speeder storm, that's functionally 2 units, but it's in one thing. And so the reason I say it's going to take at least 2 activations to deal with that is because you need a unit that can catch an angle to the transport, and then once that dies, you would need a unit that would also be able to catch an angle to kill the stuff that gets out. So functionally, if I take a land speeder storm and I can put it up on a midfield objective, I know that, I'm not just telling my opponent, you have to shoot this or I'm going to score points. It's you have to find a way to make 2 units able to shoot this in order to stop me from scoring points. And if I'm pulling away their activations, they're going to not be able to shoot, If I'm pulling activations to go and kill my nonsense, the more I can pull away to have them deal with the scouts, the less they're going to shoot the stuff I really care about.
Thank you, sir. Ward, please continue.
And that's durability. Durability doesn't have to mean like old Deathwing Terminators in cover, right? Like it doesn't have to be like you literally can't kill me, right? But like with clever terrain placement, you might put a crate or a ruined building or any other thing that can either provide line of sight blocking via obscuring or first floor blocking or even true line of sight, blocking true line of sight. Is exactly what you said. Like, cool, you can kill my speeder. That's all fine and good. If you don't kill it, I'm going to just score my primary. But if you do, I can, because of, again, clever terrain placement, I can just disembark and you can't see me. And I'm still on the objective, right? So if durable to me is just something that I create, and Cox and I have kind of talked about this, it's a clock, right? It's an internal clock on the game state. So having practiced against Goffs a number of times against Cox, you run into this, and most players don't know this with orcs. When they wah and they're like murdering up the table, like you can't blink, because the moment that you do, your clock is dead. Because not only have you paused and you're like, well, I don't know what to do. They're all over me, right? Or inversely, if you just like, oh, okay, what's your threat range, and you cede all that board to them, you're just playing into their game plan, right? So having been put on a clock before, where Cox is like, I'm going to score an 87 or whatever that score, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head, but I'm going to score an 87. Can you score an 87? And if the answer to that question is no, you are the player on the clock. So durability comes in the form of, at least in the list that I'm bringing, in 16 aggressors, right? That will have other advantages in other missions, but specifically in abandoned sanctuaries, depending on where terrain is placed and whatever, with another tech piece that I have built into the list, you're on a clock. If 16 aggressors meet you in the middle and they get there first, or if it's advantageous to getting there second, with various tech pieces to that, that's a lot of attacks. That's a lot of power fists. That's a lot of T5 transhuman, -1 to hit from Tigerius, Psychic Fortress, An apothecary 6-up feel no pain, so even if you do have damage 3, if I roll 1-6, like that one aggressor is soaking an extra wound. You're gating each like if I'm harder to hit, that's the first gate. If I'm transhuman, that's the second gate. I mean, if I'm a space marine, so I'm a 3-up save, or a 2-up in cover if it's shooting, or if I got Psychic Fortress off, I have an invulnerable save against high AP, and then okay, a wound did go through, then I have another check to see if that one wound ends up killing a model. So you're just creating inefficiencies for a player, for an opponent, in each step of that process. No matter how good it is, I mean, a 6-up Fennel Pain is only 16% of a chance, right? But on a 3 damage weapon, that's going to soak 5 wounds, right? And then obviously you have the chance to roll triple 6s, which that's happened before. And the apothecary just brings 1 back, right? So I mean, it's all kind of the package that you build. I mean, I don't mind telling because the list isn't going to change, but imagine all those aggressors being able to heroically intervene. And then all of those aggressors having a fight last mechanic via an Ultramarine specific warlord trait. And imagine you also have a fight first psychic power from Tigurius. How are you going to combat 16 aggressors? Right? I'm just creating a problem. Meanwhile, the Desolators and Gilliman and Landspeeders and Infiltrators and Eliminators are all doing the other part of the mission that's scoring primary, and you are now the one on the clock. So the durability is in the form of these guys are not going to be easy to kill. Will they die? Most certainly they will, right? But if they die too slowly, there you go.
And there was that word again, Desolators. I feel like we'll probably be saying that a couple times over the course of this.
Pow pow, Desolators.
Watch out for my Nerf gun.
Which specifically does solve the scouts coming out of a speeder, but if you're shooting Castellan launchers at scouts, like that's going to feel real bad. But
maybe saving on a 2-up.
It may be applicable.
It'll be annoying.
And sometimes the point is just to annoy your opponent. Ben, how are your dwarves dealing with abandoned sanctuaries, man? This does not feel great for you, considering that a big chunk of your army wants to move in those bikes, right?
Right, yeah. So typically what I try to do is I deploy on one side of the board, but I kind of like, while we're setting up, I'm measuring like, okay, if I put one bike squad here in the center, what's 12 inches to the right? Okay, and then basically I kind of like shove everything to win to one corner and hope that my opponent either deploys to counter that, like, and I'll obviously tell them like, hey, I can pregame move, and they'll normally say, hey, like, you can't, because no man's land. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, I can't, but I can still like move around in my deployment zone. They're like, oh okay, yeah, and then they forget about it because they don't think about pregame moving, and so I kind of either hope that they go into the opposite corner and deploy a little bit more aggressively on the opposite side of my bikes, or they like are like, oh, he's putting all his bikes here, I'm going to shove all my stuff here in this other corner to try to alpha strike me. And then depending on what they do, I can just then spread my bikes back out across the rest of the board in my own deployment zone. Obviously not getting much out of it, but mainly just trying to force my opponent into a corner without even really sacrificing anything. And for me, this is one where I have to decide how much of a gun line that I am. And kind of like what Ward mentioned earlier of just terrain placement on this one is going to be key, especially with holding the center as the secondary, or I guess the tertiary. Like you score, I think it's like 40 something points, 42 points out of 45 on primary. If you hold just your deployment zone and the center, you score 42 out of 45 points on primary. And so it's really interesting that like I can either say, hey, I'm just going to shove everything I have in the middle, and if you can deal with it, great. If you can't, I'm probably going to just be able to shoot you to death. And otherwise, if it is against 16 aggressors, like Ward has, I probably would just be going for the outside and shooting in, or just saying kind of like, well, I guess he's just going to score 42. Hopefully I can just be hold more each turn and killing off everything else and letting the aggressors do their own thing. But it's an interesting one. And with the deployment zone shenanigans, like we said with Bryce, turn one, my Terminators have like the Warp Strike crest, which is I get 1 free teleport per game outside of 9. And so I can be throwing 5 Terminators into someone's deployment zone turn 1. And that is always catches people off guard. Again, not in a like, oh, I didn't tell them, but more just like they don't really expect me to do it. And if they set up for it, then it's like, okay, well, you just put yourself in a position to not be able to probably do what you wanted just to screen out 5 Volkite guns. I think when people think of Terminators from Votann, they think they're actually pretty hard hitting, and they're really not. They're pretty garbo. When it comes to like melee combat, like their Volkites with rerolls do work. I mean, you're getting mortals to hit on 6s, so and it's really nice. But after that, they're kind of just tanks, and you can just use them again as a clock of -1 damage, T5, 2 up, 4 up. You can throw a Feel No Pain on them. Like, you can really make them stick around for longer than they deserve to be around. And so I kind of use that as an advantage. Behind enemy lines is typically pretty good because I can double move my bike. So if I really need to, I can be throwing something into the deployment zone. Turn 1, I guess I'd actually be like a half an inch short. But yeah, so it's not bad. It's going to come down to how terrain is set up, simply because if I can create good lanes to keep you off objectives, I can just be sitting center and shooting you off, or I could let you hold the center and just try to just gun line you down as fast as possible. So it's not one that I feel too bad about, but it is a bit of a harder one to play around in certain matchups. So
do the two of you that have redeploys find that value increases or decreases on that map, given that it's going to be player placed terrain?
That is a great question.
I mean, having access to a redeploy, or regardless if you're restricted to stay outside no man's land, that always has value, right? If you put aggressors on the line over here, right, like that might deter somebody from putting an extra 10, 15, 20% of their army on that side of the board. You know, that's more of a, I call it a table side decision, right? Like if you see an opportunity, right, like I'm just gonna deploy everything behind cover or behind obscuring terrain, and then it's like, oh, I got first turn, cool. I'll spend my CP to redeploy everything on the line, and just like here the clock starts now, like, because I mean, there's other synergies with aggressors and Gilman, right? They get a +1 to advance, so when you take all that and just shoot it up the board, if you get good advance rolls and you've kind of strategically placed some cover and stuff, like, oh, now I have 16 aggressors behind cover in the middle of the table, or in cover on objectives, or, you know, and when they can heroically intervene, and when they can, you know, all the other stuff. It's just, I think that is going to be good. If it is not, it isn't. It's just a decision point that I have made, as far as I think I'm going to see X, Y, and Z in like different armies at the event. I think there will be kind of, I call them the Power 5. Like, there will be 5 S tier, A+ tier armies that good people will bring, and you need to have some tech for those type of armies. So I think having high volume bolter fire and force and saves, and then having power fists with some fight phase shenanigans can be also pretty good too.
Yeah, on my end, like I said, my whole game plan is hoping that my opponent deploys in a way that responds to where my bikes are, and then I just kind of say, just kidding, that's not where they're going. And if that happens, great. If it doesn't, it's not the worst thing in the world, because I can always put them where I need to, like Ward said, behind obscuring, or just kind of leave them where they are. So I think terrain honestly is going to be big, especially for me with my Thunderkin. If I can get crossboard shots, like, sure, you set up me not being able to shoot you from my deployment zone, but if I have space on the side and I can shoot my beamers across 36 inches across the board and be hitting 3 units, I'll take that all day. Like, especially with people like expecting me to just be coming at them, they're going to have lanes on the side wide open. So yeah, but I think redeploys will be good. It just, like I said, it's going to be army dependent. So
Okay, and then we move from a map that is very laterally focused into a map that is much more linear. In the Scouring. Oh boy, if you thought that there were going to be some people catching hands on abandoned sanctuaries, you might as well just stamp E on this aggressor fist because they're rated A for everyone.
Also a big decision point for my list choices. I'm like, oh, the scouring?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll just like throw my entire army at you and there you go.
Yeah, so I've been real busy with grad school this past month, so I haven't really had a chance to go through this mission pack in depth. And this is kind of my first time. I'm like, wow, they're really putting you through the ringer day one, man. None of these games are going to play the exact same way.
Yeah, no, man, it's.
I mean, none of them do, but these are some varied missions day one.
I mean, between bombs, abandoned sanctuaries, and then scouring, you've got some very diverse gameplay that's going to be happening.
Yeah, the math on this one works out really interesting. So it's, again, another just, if you hold 2, you're getting 32 points. If you Auspex scan turn 1, which basically everyone's guaranteed to do that at least once, that's 35 out of 40 points. So that means that you're needing to score a hold more at least twice and do a second Auspex scan in order to score a perfect 45. So you're really having to just kind of pedal to the metal. Here's my army. I'm sitting here taking the center, or I'm taking your side objective and triangling it up, whatever it is. Otherwise, you're not going to have a high primary score, which I'm interested to see how you guys, or hear how you guys then counter that with your secondary mission side of this. Like, obviously, on my end, I don't want to be actioning too much just because that takes away shooting power to kill somebody. But if I can be, like, if I can just have full kill secondaries, that's a win for me. But I'm interested to hear how you guys will handle the primary / secondary balancing.
This one's interesting for me. I forget the name of the category, but essentially it's the movement one. So on the scouring, I'm often conflicted between 2 picks in the same category. On the one hand, behind enemy lines is always really appealing to me on this mission because if you look at the map, you just see just how big your deployment zone is. It's very easy to tap something in there for those behind enemy lines points. But the other hand, from a Marine standpoint, this is a very aggressive mission that I'm also very tempted by shock tactics. The Marine one, for those you don't know, it's if you can steal an objective from your opponent that they controlled at the start of your turn, it's worth 4 points. It's usually pretty reliable. Blood Angels won the Kansas City Open off the back of it when they bumped it from 3 to 4. So, that was the thing Marines needed. But it's hard for me, right? Because it's like, do you want to go with behind enemy lines, which is, it's harder to play around, right? Your opponent can try and deny you shock tactics. But shock tactics is pretty easy on this map.
Well, and I think there's some right, because it kind of getting into how I make my decisions and stuff. Every unit has a role to play in the list. That role can change within missions, right? But on the scouring for you, Bryce, like, if your opponent doesn't have a way to screen out that much real estate, like, very few armies will, but drop a drop pod and cool, like, drop pod's 1 unit and the unit inside's the second.
I hate everyone always assumes the drop pod wants to drop somewhere aggressively. And don't get me wrong, it definitely does, but man, that can just really come back to bite you. Like, if you drop the pod, what I've found is if you drop an Iron Hands drop pod, like, in your opponent's deployment zone, 2 things will happen. 1, you will probably have a really good shooting phase that turn. But you probably don't have a good enough shooting phase if your opponent is hiding from the stuff in your deployment zone. What will happen after that is you will lose the Devastators because they're just a Marine body, and then there's a nice drop pod sitting in their deployment zone that they go, oh, cool, I'm safe from your shooting for a turn. And that's, when you're a shooting army, that's really
I'm talking
not
about
what you want.
putting it in the corner, like Don was saying with bombs. Like, this is an inconvenience for you now. I took behind enemy lines, and now you either have to I mean, and you benefit from it immediately. It comes down, they get out, 4 points, voila, like that's it, right? And then it creates this annoyance, like for me, right? For fellow Marine player shooting list here, I'm like, now I have to go kill that drop pod because otherwise, that drop pod, that one singular drop pod, if in turn one, you'd likely probably wouldn't have a drop pod behind. You might, I don't know, but like that one drop pod's 15 points if left alone, right? It doesn't create any threat. Like, oh, I'm getting shot by a couple storm bolters. That's not a big deal, but it's an annoyance. It's something that needs to be answered, right? So,
in the world in our current world of free multi-meltas, it's not too hard to find some dude's land speed or tornado to just peel off and go pick that thing up.
They got to hit. They got to hit and wound.
Yeah.
You're thinking about the Marine matchup, though, Bryce. Like, you're thinking about the Marine matchup. There's so many armies out there that don't just trivially have
Don and I
20
talked about
multi-meltas
this.
sitting in their back pocket, right? Like, if you drop that in the corner for my army, I'm just like, well, I guess screw off. Like, I got to turn my hive tyrant around and go kill this stupid thing, or you just get 9 points minimum. Like, I've got to make a commitment to go remove that T7, T8, 12 or 15 wounds. Stupid.
T6, 8 wounds.
Even still, that's not a trivial commitment.
Yeah. No, and I get what you're saying, and I acknowledge, like, I've done it before. Don't get me wrong. I've stuck a pod in the deployment zone in a place that's inconvenient. It's usually not my default plan with the pod. Normally, I like to make people, like, I find that the threat of the pod is often in its threat projection more than its damage. It's something that's very scary to hang above an opponent, and the more that you hang above them, the more they have to screen, the more that they have to usually expose other things to your guns trying to screen out the pod. It's pretty versatile. It's a versatile piece. But that kind of gets back to, going back to secondaries. I'm torn between those two. I think both work for the type of list I'm trying to play into this mission.
Yeah, this is also one of the missions that I feel is very easy to score primary on because of the change in Arcs of Omen, where used to the scouring you had to start the action and survive until your next command phase. Now it just completes at the end of your turn, right? So you would have to have built in your list some, like, oh, okay, I really don't need this unit to do anything other than score 3 points. Now that depends on the army. That depends on what you feel at the table edge. Like, okay, I can probably afford to put this 60-point unit or 75-point unit right here, and with the hopes that it makes it to that objective on your opponent's side, right? If you're gonna spend an asset for deploy, or a unit that has enough speed to just like zip across the board and boop start that action, like you're gonna have to have a really good reason for it. Or have the ability to do so. But with player place terrain, you're going to be able to probably set up those two objectives on your side of the table for fairly easy scans, right? So if you have a passive gameplay, this is how I'm going to score my secondaries passively. That's a 32 on just holding 2, and then another 6, right? So if 38 plus your secondaries, right, again creates that clock for your opponent, like this is the most I can score if I only do this. And that's how Cox and I always played our games. Like, I'm not going to wall. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to do good bits. I'm going to do green tide. And I'm going to get the biggest and the best. And pass.
With that thought, I really want to just chime in and say, like, the priority objective to scan in this mission is the center objectives, round 1 and 2. If you can get there and get that scan off, you've secured it, and you now no longer have to worry about it the rest of the game. Particularly if, like Bryce said, with a crap-ass land speeder that nobody cares about, right? Boop, scanned. Or, I don't remember if this is infantry only. Either way, right? Your trivial unit.
It's not. I've already looked.
Yeah, so you scan the objective. If you can get that middle one, turn 1, you have just secured yourself a 3-point leg up.
Yeah. No, the kicker for this action, right, is... The kicker for this one is you can't start the action if there's any enemy units on it. So even if you control the objective itself for primary points, you can't perform a scan if there's some guy standing on there. Which is where forward deploy on this is very valuable, because if you can forward deploy onto that middle, Ward's giving me a look. I know you run what, 6 forward deploy units. It's a lot, but you get a forward deploy, you get him up on there, and you win that go first roll. You're starting off with probably a 9 out of possible 15 scans, pretty safely locked to your score.
It seems like, given the amount of trash play of just throwing some trash into the middle so your opponent can't scan it, this is going to play a lot like Old Stranglehold.
I would certainly agree with that.
But it's Old Stranglehold where things are a bit more compressed because you're fighting linearly, so you're having to throw trash into guns because there's so much more space. You can, if the terrain is placed well, you can create yourself some absolutely ridiculous firing lines.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously we don't know what the terrain sets look like that we'd be choosing for tableside, but I mean, I would hope, right, certainly that they're symmetric in really the only advantage you get from being the attacker and the defender is the first drop. But if you had a good set of ruins and some and containers, and you can deploy them in such a way you can set up for melee armies, this is where I'm going to approach from. This is where I'm going to stage, because you're going to have to hold an objective, and if you can stage on your side of the table just behind a ruin and move X inches depending on what your army is, then you're creating this threat saturation that's he's getting 12s, or he's created that durability in whatever manner that looks like, that he's going to score a 12, and if you have the shooting, or if the terrain dictates that you can shoot somebody off of one of their home objectives, then they're scoring a 4, and now they are behind, and they have to start making plays, right? So oh, and I totally meant to say this earlier when Bryce was talking about shock tactics. I am not big on shock tactics, but this one is one that I would very, 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 very highly consider, just because the objectives are so compact.
And the relatively high primary score in this one means, even though you're trading back and forth on that center objective, you're still getting the 32 for holding your 2, plus you're going to get to scan your home 2 for another 8. So you're looking at a 40, but because you're getting that much primary and still trading on the center, you're just pushing the value of shock tactics up. Most of the time, I feel like shock tactics is a great way to compensate for having a low primary score, because either you're trading on the objective or you're getting primary points, but in this specific instance, because your primary is going to be so high as a baseline, you're going to get a lot more value out of shock tactics.
Yeah, it just partners really well with Oaths. On this mission, you're just even more increasingly rewarded for doing what you're going to do anyway, which is fight over the center.
That's exactly right.
Now, and I know that we're going to touch on this more when we talk about the player place terrain, but just to highlight, in this particular mission, you can touch the 2 objectives from your deployment. You can place terrain in such a way as to block the visual from the opposing side, but it's also relevant because of the way that these deployments are set up and how big the deployment zone is. Like we talked about, behind enemy lines being really valid, deep striking coming in and being more prevalent in this particular mission. It's important to set up counterintuitive screening pieces of terrain, right? If somebody's got a couple drop pods, it doesn't hurt to throw a stupid piece of ruins that you're not going to use elsewhere just in an awkward corner of your board that makes it really, really difficult for them to drop the drop pod there, right?
Yeah, if you've got a random crate you're not going to use because of the way this map actually sets up its crate rules, then that's a reasonable use for that crate.
And that's day 1.
That is day 1. Holy actual crap! That mission set is it's pretty rough.
It's gonna be a rough day 1, guys. I'm feeling a drink at the end of day 1.
It's gonna be a day. I think we touch on this with all the missions, and we'll touch it in part 2. But man, you're gonna need to know how player placed works. Each one of those missions is going to be so impacted by where you put your terrain in all kinds of and neither one is going to be the same. It's just you're going to need to know how you're placing terrain on each mission, because they're just so varied.
Yeah, and
definitely.
Just to kind of touch on that, Bryce, that's obviously going to be our second section here. This episode is probably going to run longer than our normal, but we really want to prepare for this event and make sure that everybody's good to go. And
So we go from a mission where everybody is punching everybody in the face and it's very compacted, and we go into my least favorite mission in the entire book, Death and Zeal.
Okay, I want to preface this for those of you who are listening. Learn from my mistakes. When you're deploying and you're putting your units out, hide them behind terrain, but don't put anyone on your home objective. I cannot tell you how many times I've played this mission and put something on my home just trying to, deploy as normal, and then I read that mission primary blurb, you score 3 points if you control an objective marker you didn't at the start of your turn, and I go, oh, well, I deployed myself out of 3 easy points, and now I gotta try and go get it from a no man's land objective if I want that this turn. Don't do it. Learn from me.
Yeah, I don't like the play pattern that this map creates. I don't love it. I mean, it feels like it's just extra for doing what you're already doing in the game. Like there's no ancillary need to change what you're thinking about. You're just okay. You're playing the primary. Have extra points for playing the primary.
Don't forget you also score points for killing units off objectives too. So.
Yeah.
But but you're playing the primary. I mean, if you're not
you're
killing,
gonna do that.
Yeah, right. If you're not killing units that are on objectives, then what are you doing?
Yeah. So and again, like that's why I was like, bombs requires you to do something very specific to score those extra primary. Death and Zeal is just a 32 if you can forward deploy or whatever. For me, I'm like, cool, I have enough, even if I don't get the first drop as far as units are concerned with forward deploy. If both armies have forward deploy, I put something on my home objective, I put something on this other objective. If I can hold those two or hold the middle at any point, given the fact that I'm bringing a big package of stuff that wants to play Oath of Moment anyway, right? If I can hold two and kill a unit a turn off an objective, that's 42 points. If you walked into a game where you are going to score 42 points on primary,
deal, take it, done.
Yep, there'd be no questions about. Yeah, I'll take 42. I'd totally be fine with that, and there'd be no questions. All right, so I think that's just a big look at your army, look at the mission pack, look at the mission, each mission 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is my expected value, and then work from there. Right. Build into your secondaries.
Yeah, this mission, this one definitely rewards turtling in for most armies of being able to just sit on the back two. And well, at least I say this as a more gunline focused army. I can just sit either bottom left, top right as the red deployment player B, and just be holding those two and then shooting you off the center. And again, that comes down to terrain placement of okay, well, if I get first drop, I'm definitely making sure that centerpiece there will be nothing.
Yeah, it's going to be a crater.
Me. Right. Crater forest, it's boom, done.
You know what this mission's real rough on? Or it can be on player place format? Melee armies. Melee armies can have a real rough time on this.
Oh, I kind of... I do agree, but I also slightly disagree. Is this the one that I got bodied on? I think this was the one at Denver that I got absolutely smashed on by a Blood Angels guy because of how he set up his terrain. Actually, nope. It was a diagonal one.
That is the main caveat.
So
Blood Angels.
Let me explain why I say that. The reason why I say that is because your deployment zones are corner to corner. Literally, you can be as far as possible from your enemy units if you want to see that much. I've been playing some practice games, getting ready for this, and I played this practice scenario into World Eaters through drops of terrain, and I've had it also where I've deliberately given him the first terrain drop because Iron Hands versus World Eaters was very easy to figure out what would happen if I got to place the first terrain drop. But even then, if you can use your terrain to create firing lanes off of this to objectives, you can stand way back there with some long-range stuff, and they can kind of do nothing about it.
Yeah, and that was the caveat I was going to say. It is the shortest deployment zone, too, in all of the mission packs. Any of the corner ones, you're 18 inches away. You don't get that in any other mission because they're all 24, right? So would imagine that you're 6 inches closer, right? So that would favor an army that wants to hit your hit the deployment zone, and it can, right? But that comes down to a lot more to that first terrain drop. Like it's like going first in a planet bowling ball. Like if you can put a good ruin to stage in, like that's going to benefit you, right? Because then you can start putting pressure on their home objective. But if there's this just gigantic barren wasteland of no terrain, and you're trying to cross that, having played that matchup on Abandoned Sanctuaries, not Death and Zeal, but having played that against a World Eaters player at March Madness, when there's limited terrain and they have to come 24 inches across the board to you, and you can get firing lanes, they just don't ever get there because they're just dead.
This is true for all player-placed events, but I always look at this mission in particular as one that you can definitely win or lose in your terrain deployment. Like you need to know,
this is absolutely the one where your terrain placements on this map have to be the most tight. We're going from the map in the scouring, where your terrain placements can be a little bit more loose. You have the most leeway in making your terrain placements, to this map, where if your terrain placements are not on point, you are going to get dumpstered.
And just to touch on those terrain placements real quick, you guys mentioned the barren wasteland of no terrain in the center. It's double bad when that barren wasteland gives you a -2 to movement, and your whole game plan is based on getting to that other deployment side as quickly as possible, particularly for like
just
some of those
fly.
melee
It's
armies
fine.
that are just fly.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Sure.
great.
Yeah.
You play
Unless-
Harlequins, right?
Yeah, no, I'll fly through it. That's
Yeah,
fine.
it's great.
But World Eaters are just going from 8 or 6 movement down to 6 or 4. Like,
I mean,
Wait, you guys take movement penalties?
So I'm gonna.
we also
Well-
we also move faster than 5 inches, Ben.
Whoa.
No, we
not
don't.
me.
What are you talking about?
I've got bikes, baby. I'm probably the fastest army on the board.
That's probably
So I'm going to
true.
create a scenario for you, Bryce, and Don, and everybody. So we kind of already established, right? This is a fairly easy mission to score secondary on, or primary rather. That if you can kill a unit a turn on an objective, probably going to be able to do that. That's kind of a byproduct of playing the game. Or taking a unit that you didn't, or taking an objective you didn't control before, or that gets you a 42 on primary. Then take into account that you go second with like Seal of Oath, or not Seal of Oath, a moment, and like March from a Crag, right? If you march here, and if you go second, you can march on the end game.
Can you give me an example that doesn't require Smurfs?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is like mentally, because like you don't know what the third secondary is, or I don't. That would kind of depend on what I'm playing. But I know that I will always take March, and I will always take Odes with this given mission set. So I know that if I can score 42, right, which we just discussed, I can march 3 objectives. That's a 12, right, and that's being conservative. And if you have the bottom of the turn with enough land speeders or eliminators or your big old aggressor, like that's likely going second, a 15 on Oath of Moment. That is a 42 and a 27. Like, you're at 69. Ooh.
Nice.
Hey.
Before even you get to your third secondary, right? Like, what that looks like, you don't know, but you have to, this is a good mission to get a baseline of like, I should be able to score 42 if I'm playing the game. And these are my secondaries, and this is how much I should score on them. And kind of, and when your opponent's taking their turn, kind of flip through the mission pack. Like, okay, he took these secondaries. This is how he scores them. How can I limit how he scores them with my game plan in mind? And do I hold him to less than that magic value you have written on your hand? Right? Like, if his primary plus 2 secondaries, his best secondaries, is less than a 69, you don't have to be aggressive. Like, you can just play that kind of turtle up, only playing that short triangle to the middle of the board. So
No, and I really like that you kind of touch on that. Like disruption is really big in this mission because, like you mentioned, it's like a 42-point base for primary, right? So if you can limit that for your opponent at any point, that's huge.
For a shooting army.
Sure. Yeah. But something that Bryce like keyed me into is the disruption of planning that into your list, right? And something that I really adjusted my list building to for this event was doing what you just said. Ward is taking these missions and like what secondaries can I get to create this baseline minimum score, right? Like I can get to 32 on this mission for primary, almost guaranteed, right? I can, unless everything's just gone real bad and whatever, right?
No, to kind of answer your question, Ward, my goal on this mission, if I'm going second, is a 92. Planning for 15s on Oath behind enemy lines, and I probably just take banners and I try and lock in a 10 and hope and try and go from there.
Are you not worried about banners at all with the reduced size of this deployment zone? Like, or not
my
banners, behind enemy lines, sorry.
The speeders are quick enough to go in and do it. I've got 4 of them that can zip up if they stage decently well. Plus,
talking about doing behind enemy lines.
You what?
Not on this map, you're not.
So, like...
You are not taking behind enemy lines.
Behind enemy lines
map.
is kind of one of my go-tos for this list, and this is the one map that I'm concerned with it on because of the reduced deployment size and the fact that there's so much incentive to just kind of cluster up and castle on that side of the field. You might have 4 speeders to throw in there. I have 3 units that are going to go into behind enemy lines. If they don't get multiple turns of value, they're just not worthwhile, right?
Fair. I haven't looked at it too in depth. Those have been the standard I've been going for.
A 9's a 9.
9 is a 9.
Yeah, but sure, but I mean, you can, with that same 3 units, you can generally get, a 6, or with a reasonable terrain placement, you can get, an 8 or a 10 on engage if you're playing reasonably. Like, so it might be that your upside in this case is engage. For me, as the generally melee player, I look at this and I'm like, so my entire game plan is to push both of our primary scores to 45 and try to win on secondaries. And in Marines, that's just not really possible with as strong as your secondary game is right now. When we had, as Orc specifically, when we had biggest and the best, I could get, a 35 and not leave my house on my secondaries.
Which sucked.
But, yeah,
play
right.
against.
But now that we're down to 2 good secondaries, right? You're really having to try to find a third, and the Space Marines have got Oath of Moment, and Codex Warfare is still fine in a lot of cases, especially on a map where there's so many firing lines here. You're going to get those 5 points on Devastator Doctrine. You're still going to probably get 2 or 3 on Tactical Doctrine.
Not if you're a Dev Doctrine army.
Well, I mean, that's sure, right? But yeah, I guess that's the price you pay for being a filthy meta chaser.
100%. I accept it. I accept my punishment.
You don't even have to change you don't even have to change your paint scheme. You just have to change a keyword, man.
Soon.
I think for me as your... Sorry, go ahead, Cox. You finish up. I thought you were done. My bad.
Oh, no, I just don't love this map as a melee. It is very frustrating as a melee army because I know that I am not going to be able to beat you on primary. I just have to push us both up on primary and try to find a way to squeeze you out of some secondary points because I'm not going to hold you, below a 40. It's not going to happen. Even with as much OBSEC as I have, 1 CP makes something OBSEC. On 18-inch moving Storm Boys, I can just throw across the map and just take your objectives from you. You're going to kill them. You're going to take an objective that you didn't have previously. It's just so hard to keep your primary score down that secondary is where this mission is decided.
Yeah, and for me on my end with Votan, our secondaries are pretty hot garbage, if we're being honest.
They are.
But with this mission, being that they are mostly like kill focused, like you're already to play the game, you are just trying to kill. This is a Votan dream because all I have to do, I don't have to take action secondaries. It's a bring it down or a grind or a no prison, whatever it is. I mean, it's assassinate, no prisoners, and then like probably a movement one where it's like engage, or like maybe I scan objectives. I don't know, but it is just I just go to kill you, and then I worry about primary later. Like that's how I beat a Necron's player at Shiloh. It was I think I took R&D and I scored a 8 on it, but because everything else that I took maxed out, I beat him by a couple points. It was a super close game, super great game, but it was just that because every time I kill something, I'm scoring 3 times. And so this one is actually really fun for me to be able to play.
And we go from my least favorite map into the finals, which is probably one of my favorite maps in Prios, because there's a lot of moving parts here, literally. It's Secure Missing Artifacts, and that is a lot of fun. It's just a fun map to play. It also happens to be corners, I believe, is it not?
Yeah, it's
corners to center.
Yeah, corners.
So just a point of note here. This is the second map in the pack that is corners deployment. So if you want to practice deployment and get the most value for your time, practice deploying corners, because you're going to get double the value out of your practice.
There's and especially with this one, there's something fun. So the tertiary is you're moving objectives, and then you're picking one, or you pick one for your opponent to hold. If you're playing an army that has a tertiary or a secondary that focuses on doing actions in no man's land, you can make it where they only have 3 objectives to be able to use. If you choose, like if you go first, or even if you go second and they don't move their side no man's land, you can put that into their deployment zone so they can no longer do that secondary. So Sisters, Orcs, Votan.
I think it changes the score on March for McCrag too.
Yeah. Like anything like that, you can easily take that away. And
can you not march home now?
Oh, you most certainly can march your home objective. That's why it's so good.
It's not even reduced.
I was about to say, it doesn't hurt March anymore.
It's such bullshit.
Does anybody hear that salt noise?
All right, no. So moving on. Something with this priority objective is the priority objective with player placed terrain that I found super cheeky at my last player placed event. Because you move the objective and you place the terrain before you move the objective, you can oftentimes place that terrain in what you think is a very beneficial place for you, and your opponent can then just move the objective 6 inches, right? So they can you have it nestled into this nice little safety zone, and now all of a sudden it's not. So when you place your terrain, it's super relevant to kind of place with that 6-inch window in mind. And granted, because of the way that the board half cuts for this mission pack, you can't completely make it safe, but you can certainly make it a pain in the butt for them to deal with. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think this is probably going to be really, really janky for a lot of people that haven't done either enough of this map or enough player placed or both, because this one is really going to reward having preset your terrain pieces enough times to know where they go, to just make sure that you're able to hold your 2 on your half safely.
So this is a question for kind of the group here. So the wording on repositioning, it's within 6 inches horizontally. I've played at 3 different tournaments now. 2 of them have ruled the same way. 1 of them has not, and that one was the Geekery, where horizontally to them is literally just right or left, like east or west, not north and south. Like you can't just move it in any direction 6 inches. You have to move it left 6 inches or right 6 inches. And so I'm interested to know if y'all have played it the same way, or is it just like, because Peyton explained it to me that it's for some reason they made it where you can't move it up. Like it horizontally means any direction on the map as long as it stays on the ground.
You just got to stay level with the tabletop, right? And Geekery has updated. I don't know who ruled on your placement at Geekery, but that's where I was at last, and that's where I played this event, and we had that same question. I believe her name is Jenny, that came up and talked to us, had the same ruling as Peyton, and that it's anywhere along the edge or along the tabletop, right? You cannot move it up.
Okay.
You cannot move it to tier 2 of the ruins or whatever. That's what the wording means for horizontally, not vertically.
Yeah, it's going to be something that we probably need to reach out to the March Madness TO for, because I understand the interpretation of moving it on essentially the x-axis, horizontally to the map that you would look at, right? Like moving it north-south would be vertically. I'm not sure how March Madness or how Midwest Conquest is going to rule it. Probably need to clarify.
That's worth reaching out. Yeah, for sure.
The major, the real question is, why did they even bother specifying it? Because, you can't end the disc for an objective inside of a terrain piece, so why would they specify that it can't move, that it can only move horizontally? Because you can't move it vertically, because the only place you could end vertically would be inside of a terrain piece, and that would not be allowed per rule.
Right. So then that's when the question comes into: do they mean left and right, like the x-axis only?
Yeah,
so,
right.
Yeah, it's funky for sure.
I think it's unnecessary wording. I think they're just being verbose because they can.
Well,
and so kind of mixing both of these points of what Dom was saying and not being able to put it in a terrain piece, you can actually force your opponent's hand on a terrain piece where you can put that terrain 6 inches in a direction where they can't really put it where it's good for them, and so they're kind of you can force them to put it somewhere suboptimal for them. So that's something else that's kind of a fun little tidbit to do when you're practicing player places, realizing how much a terrain piece actually covers and where you want that objective marker to go. You can manipulate it if you want to.
So I have a question kind of continuing on from what Ben was saying on this mission, kind of for everybody. Do you find that you want to be the attacker who gets to move the first A or B, or do you want to be the defender who gets to move 2 objectives? You get to move the other A or B depending on what your opponents chose, and then you get your pick of the remaining 2.
I've always preferred going second.
Mine is faction specific. I want the first pull because I have to be able to do good bits.
So it depends on my matchup. Right now with Monster Mash and the Heavy OBSEC, in most cases, I would prefer to go second and disrupt their game plan and secure my deployment zone, right? Because they almost never move your deployment zone first. But there are some matchups, particularly fast movement, high OBSEC armies, where I want to go first and I want to move my objective to security, right? But for the most part, I prefer second.
See, so Cox said it is matchup dependent. I've found that in many instances, playing a shooty faction, I do enjoy going first because I like to take, like Dom was saying, take that objective that they assume is safe and pull it out to where guns can see it.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking I'm pretty agnostic. Like, it to me, it's just like, and given that kind of with player place terrain, you kind of meld some of this together, right? So if you win the attacker defender role, you get to place terrain first, and then also get to choose to be the. Well, I can't remember how that works actually.
No, it's attacker places
right.
A or moves A.
Right. So then you are right, because if you want to be the defender for the first terrain drop, right? Like most of the time, I think every time you're going to want that. You're going to be pinholed into deploying the 2 set, right? Because that it says the defender. So I've never found that this mission really matters where the mission, like where the objectives land. Because this is out of the pack probably the easiest mission to score primary on.
You just commit
because you get a 15. Like you control your primary objective marker. Granted, your opponent picks it, but I'm gonna just put this unit on here. The only way that it would negatively affect it is if you are a very elite army that doesn't have the model count to just put a scout squad or a speeder or a
it's super great. Super great.
So you're fine, right, Ben?
If you walk into like a 2/7 night list, you can really mess with them that way.
I mean, Custodes as well. Like, you can super disrupt Custodes' game plan on this particular mission layout if they don't commit hard enough to their priority objective. Unfortunately,
you could really
fortunately
mess
for
with the night
Custodes, right? Like, they've got 6 bodies on for 3, but you remove one of those suckers, or if you have, I don't know, maybe a Parasite of Mortrex that can just remove OBSEC arbitrarily from something. Like, that's a huge point shift. It goes from being a 4-point shift to a 7-point shift, that's fairly dramatic. I mean, particularly at the wrong point of the game, of just being like, oh, I guess you just don't get that. And if you can cancel out banners as well, or cancel out another one of their secondaries that they're trying to lock down, like, that's a big swing in this mission, and I love it for that.
This is going to be this will be a really good test with player place, because, like Don said, you place the terrain first, right? Like, don't know where these missions. I mean, the objectives are there, right? But you don't move them until after you've placed the terrain. So, oh, cool. Like, now that objective that I thought was going to be good for me is now not good for me. It'll kind of depend what your opponent's army wants to do as to, like, how, like a World Eater's army. If you just take their home objective and move it backwards 6 inches, like, that's going to really suck for them. Other armies, that's not going to be how you combat, having that first move or that pull on their other one, right? If an army, say for instance like Harlequins usually is fast enough to, like, being able to spread out and hit, stuff from multiple angles, like, very quickly. If you can consolidate their objectives together, like, that means you have a smaller footprint to go attack, right? There's different ways to attack, depending on the army you're playing against. Different ways to kind of screw them over with the moving their priority objective and stuff. So, and another point of note too is, like, since you get to pick it, if they don't deploy. Like, if they kind of deploy centrally on an objective, you're like, I'll pick the other one. So, again, go hold that objective that's not going to, outside of being on an objective for primary, isn't going to, do anything for you. And again, that kind of punishes more elite armies. Like, go send this 150, 200 point unit over here to hold this objective while I hold it with a speeder.
Well, and I think that combines your points for it. If you can move, like, a slow-moving melee army's deployment zone objective back 6 inches even after they've taken the first move, right? And you're just like, oh, well, I guess just that's your priority. It's 6 inches further back. I don't know, dude. Like, some of them can't deal with it, particularly if you have some deep strike to just kill some cultists off of it round 2 or 3. Oh, man.
Yeah. Minus 15 on primary. Like, if you can actively, and see, that even changes your target priority. How fast can this unit move? Okay, so you're going to need an X value on an advance to get to this mission, or to get to this objective to hold it. And then you just kill all the stuff that's actively working toward their priority objective. Like, I'm just going to mitigate your primary scoring because I'm not going to allow you the opportunity to move and hold your primary objective at the end of your turn. That requires playing chess a turn ahead, right? But if you're like, wait a second, that's the only unit that can move on to this objective, and you have the means to shoot that unit or fight it and tie it up,
or move screen it,
or move block it. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of ways to mitigate having somebody, or control it yourself, right? Like, I'm going to pull this objective 6 inches directly toward my army, and, like, that's your priority, buddy. Like, come get this, this objective that's, at that point, 18 inches from the deployment zone. Actually, a little bit closer than that, because it's 15 from the midline, so it'd be like 9 inches from it.
But, I mean, even still, it's closer to your deployment zone than theirs. And, I mean, in my world, like, if I can move your priority objective 6 inches closer to me and shove a T8 15 wound 2+ save monster that's OBSEC 5 on it, like, get rid of it, dude. Do your thing. This is mine for a couple turns.
I've created this problem you have to solve.
And I think that what we're seeing from this pack is that when we look at the day 1 missions, right, the day 1 missions are testing army composition. The day 2 missions are testing terrain placement, right? So you have to have both of those things married together in a nice way in order to be able to make it through this event with a reasonable score.
And it's gonna be a real big gate to the top 10, top 5. I think when you hit to day 2, and the whole theme of how this event is playing kind of changes from being like, did you build your army right, to being like, do you know how to play player place terrain?
Yeah, that's not a learning curve, that's a learning cliff, right? People are going to fall off in droves. But at this point, we're going to go one more time around the panel and make sure that everybody's had their say on how we feel about this player pack. And then we're going to take a little break, and then we'll come back for part 2, Touching Grass with our boy Ben here. After Touching Grass with Ben, we'll come back for part number 3 as we delve into how you should start looking at player place terrain if you have never done it before. So stay tuned.
Love the mission pack.
I'm good.
I think, yeah, I'm excited about it. It's probably the first one where I'm not like, oh, there's this one mission that I hate. I don't mind literally any of them. They're all great.
Because none of them are hold 2, hold more.
I was about to say, none of them are hold 2, hold more, and you guys are playing them.
I'm never going to complain about all 5 objective missions.
All right. Well, at this point, then we're going to go ahead and throw it to our boy Ben in another time and another place. Not the Ben that's here with us, but the Ben in the future that's recording about how to get healthy. And then we'll catch back up with us and the Ben in the past from the Ben in the future in a few minutes.
Welcome back to another Touching Grass with Ben, where I, Ben, talk to you about getting out and getting fit in Warhammer 40k. Hey guys, this week I'm going to be talking about things that you can specifically be doing to just either maintain or create your first steps toward a fitness life. I've been running for almost 15 years now at this point, and so I really don't know much else besides that. But I know that there are plenty of people both in the local area where I live that don't play 40K, and those that do play 40K that want to start getting fit, but they don't know how. And honestly, the best way to do it is just start creating small habits. An easy way to start this is just either when you wake up or when you go to bed. Honestly, just doing sets of 10 or 15 squats honestly is a phenomenal way to start. You can do squats, push-ups, just general stretches. You can be working towards doing some kind of core routine that is on YouTube. I can have Don link some options down in the show notes. One of them that you can look up, though, is by Coach Jay Johnson. You can do Jay Johnson hip mobility or flexibility or anything like that. And basically it's things like you're on your all fours and you're doing fire hydrants, clamshells, all this stuff. And basically you're building up leg strength. In that, it's going to be raising your heart rate. It's going to be providing plenty of muscle flexibility and strength, which is surprisingly needed when you're standing all day. Having your hips actually be strong and not just standing all day and hoping that your calves support you will go a long ways in not being fatigued toward the end of a tournament. So again, that's Coach Jay Johnson hip mobility exercises. There's 3 different tiers. There's starter, medium, and difficult. And you can do them 3 to 4 times a week. Honestly, you could do them every day if you want to. It takes 5 minutes. It's really easy way, low impact, low stress to get started. Another thing that you can be doing is just whether it's in between games or while you're painting models. Like if you honestly want to start getting fit, just 5 times a day. If you have just a hobby day that you want to go out and paint, you can. If you're if you're a batch painter where you're going to do 5 models at a time and you're doing all the same thing, each time you finish those 5 models, go outside and walk for 5 minutes hard, not even like hard, but just like a brisk walk, come back inside, do the next set of whatever the next stage is, finish that, go outside, walk 5 minutes. You're getting up and moving. So instead of sitting in the same spot for 3 to 4 hours at a time, you're getting up and you're moving your body. to over time, as like after the first couple weeks, you can turn that into a walk jog. And so you jog for 30 seconds, walk for a minute, walk for 2 minutes, whatever it is, and just go from there. Now, what I don't want y'all to do is a lot of people think that when they do this walk jog or walk run, they instantly start like running as hard as they can. That is not the goal. When you start, it should be you're almost just exaggerating a walking speed and making it look like you're running. And I'm going to be honest with you. If you're scared about what that may look like, no one cares. No one cares that you that you are self-conscious. People are going to see you doing it, and they're going to either say in their heads, wow, look at that guy, he's running, and they're going to forget about you and go back to texting and driving, or they're not even going to notice you, maybe almost hit you with their car, and then they're going to not move on. So just check your dignity at the door, because there's no better time to start than today. The best time to start getting fit was yesterday. The second best time is today, and the third best time is tomorrow. So you just gotta commit to it. I can easily be providing, like, if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out to me. I can, if you have fitness or nutritional things that you just want to start getting in order, reach out to me. I will gladly get you instructions on what to be doing. But like I said, it's easy things, just once a day, doing some kind of mobility or core, so planks, push-ups, sit-ups. If you can't even do anything of that, just do squats. Just do easy, hands out in front of you, shoulder width apart feet, and squat to a right angle, and then stand back up. Do that 15 times. Do 3 sets of 15. Every time you finish a model, or every time you finish like painting a certain section of a model, stand up and do 15 squats. Like, just doing squats elevates your heart rate enough that you're going to be getting some kind of aerobic fitness, like aerobic improvement, and then you're going to be building leg strength. And then if you toss in an evening routine of hip mobility, or you just start doing that, guys, I promise, and ladies, I promise, this will start to change how you are able to last at a tournament. So like I said, if you've got questions, you got comments, if you need more detail, I will gladly give that to you. Feel free to reach out to the podcast. You can shoot me an email. That is ledbetter.coaching@gmail.com. So LED as in dog, B as in boy, ETTER.coaching@gmail.com. Just shoot me an email with questions, and I will gladly answer them for you with whatever you got. So that's Touching Grass with Ben. Thanks, guys. Hey, y'all. Sorry I missed out on that last portion of the podcast. I had to dip to record another podcast that I'm on, completely unrelated to Warhammer. But my takes on player place terrain are essentially what I look for whenever I step up to the table. I'm typically asking myself 2 questions. The first question is, am I the gun line? And the second question is, how fast can the enemy reach out and touch me if they are melee? I learned this stuff from local resident here, Brent Simon. He plays demons, basically flamer spam and chariots and Bellicor, and he taught me basically all these things. So when I step up, if I am the gun line, I'm looking at where the objectives are, and I'm essentially trying to create space for safely shooting my opponents off the objectives while also being able to hold them and not die. So the missions that are coming up here at Midwest, they all have a center objective, and so as long as I am actually the gun line, I'm probably plopping a crate somewhere in the middle long ways, or I should say like facing me on the short side, so I have enough space to be shooting from essentially any direction that I want to, while preventing my opponent from placing obscuring terrain anywhere close to the middle. That way, at least I'm getting them off the center. That way I can throw my Sagittars up at the middle and essentially say, come and deal with my Sagittars and the 10 Berserkers that fight on death before even getting the objective. Now, if I'm not the gun line, which there are plenty of matchups where I'm not, specifically like guard, sometimes Aldari or Eldar, and in certain marine matchups, I am plopping a big piece of obscuring in the middle, and then basically then I'm creating lanes on the side so I can try to hold the center and shoot people off the sides if possible. Also, if I'm able to just create space from, like, especially, I think the last one has the deep deployment. Oh no, the scouring last mission, day 1, has a really deep deployment. So kind of Don mentioned earlier that you want to create space to prevent deep strike, or so I'm using some smaller pieces of terrain to prevent corner deep strikes, where if they're going to come in, they're going to have to come in closer to me instead of farther away. And that's essentially going to be able to force my Auspex scan that my bikes have. So I mean, it's really from there. It's that's if I'm the gun line. Now, if I'm playing a fast melee army, but I'm still the gun line, like I'm thinking things that can advance and charge, stuff that can move far, like Deathwing, or is it Raven? I think it's Ravenwing from Blood Angels. I'm looking to create instances where they aren't able to get safely to me, while I'm also able to shoot them from a distance. If I plop a piece of terrain on the side of an objective, like on my part of an objective marker, that basically gives them free reign to have the other side and be able to set up and fight me through a wall. But the nice thing is if I put it off to a corner, like at a slant, I'm going to be able to still see the majority of that objective, hold it from a safe side, and be able to shoot them off, because they're probably going to be fighting me through a wall. And so if I can make that happen and not just put it parallel to the table quarters, but instead put it at an angle where I can still be shooting them from essentially the rest of my board, that's great. I have lost plenty of matchups against, I think it was in Denver, I played a Blood Angels army that essentially after terrain was placed, he got first drop, and I just was not able to respond with any good terrain placement. And I literally said, before we even rolled off for who goes first, I said, well, it looks like you won this one because you can hold all of these objectives safely and I can't shoot you off of them. So if I wanted to come and try to take an objective, he would be able to heroic into me, or get the next turn charge. And because of first floor line of sight blocking, I wasn't going to be able to shoot him off of anything. And so essentially he was able to win that matchup straight away. So just kind of my advice as a shooting army is create firing lanes if you can. And if you can't from your deployment zone, maybe even try to throw off your opponent and deep strike some stuff. Like for me, having my Thunderkin, I plan on deep striking them. And so I'm going to be trying to create a lot of side lanes. So when I have a unit of Thunderkin come down on the left-hand side of the board and a unit come down on the right-hand side of the board, I'm going to be able to hit multiple units shooting across, because I'll be targeting with the left-hand side, targeting a unit on the right, crossing beams over everything, making wound rolls across, taking the right-hand Thunderkin, shooting across to the left-hand side, hitting everything across. And so I don't necessarily want straight up and down firing lanes. I also want horizontal firing lanes. So that's player plays for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben, and welcome back to part 3 of the Core Keyword Podcast. This is the part where we're going to be talking a little bit about player placed terrain. We understand that the best way to practice for player placed is going to be to grab a buddy and just get some reps in, but sometimes you don't have the opportunity to do that. Life comes up, we get it. So these are going to be some tips from the guys at a very high level as to what you can do when you walk up to the table to try and set up your terrain appropriately to get through the mission. Okay. So, guys, where do we start?
Good question.
I think it's commonly known that you want to win the go first roll, right? Which, haven't not had a ton of player placed terrain experience as far as actually playing a game using it. I understand kind of the advantages of terrain and the advantages of placing first or whatever. So obviously what we do know in the mission pack, right, is that you'll roll off, right? Whoever rolls off can choose to be the attacker or defender. You would probably want to be the defender because that's the first terrain placement, in addition to picking your deployment side and the other advantages to being the defender. First drop, if you have 4 deploy units or whatever, but you get to dictate one section of the map within a 4-inch bubble of whatever you place there. If you're more melee centric army, right, you might want to place a ruin within as close to the middle as possible. That way you have a staging area to put your models and to kind of dictate that threat saturation with infantry moving through the walls. You might be playing Votan or other shooting armies, Iron Hands, etc. that might find it more beneficial to put a crate there, right, and kind of lock out what you can and can't put on that central objective or on whatever portion of the board you might find advantageous, right? So kind of understanding what your army strengths are, seeing who wins that go first roll, and then making decisions from there, placing terrain to your advantage.
Yeah, for me, this will be an interesting event because I've done one player placed GT before it was in January. I can't remember, but it was up at Perils of the Geekery. That might have been in Kansas City. But I was playing Drukari at the time, so now I'm going with Iron Hands. It's a little different as far as what drops I want to try and make. As I've been... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no. But just before we get too much into the granular on this, I kind of want to just top-down view how player place works in this pack, right? Everybody gets an equivalent number of pieces of terrain. It's usually 6 or 7. One of those is a crate or a combination of crates, 1 or 2 pieces of forest, right, or dense terrain, and then a couple ruins, one of which is going to be first floor blocks line of sight. Usually that first floor blocks line of sight is your biggest piece. And these all have to be placed 4 inches away from each other and 4 inches from the edge of the game board. You can, however, place them directly on the center line, and that center line is going to be variable depending on how the deployments lay out. But with that in consideration and kind of some of what Ward and Bryce have already alluded to, this really adds some new questions, right, to your pre-game focus. And those questions are more internal than external, as opposed to some of the other ones we ask. And these questions are, am I the shooting army? Am I the movement army? Or am I the point scoring army, right? And which one of those you answer yes to is going to kind of dictate where you want to place the terrain and how you want to lay out that board, right?
Yeah, generally speaking, if you are the shooting army, you're going to slap a crate onto the center objective. If you're a melee army and you need to stage, you're going to want to put a ruin near or onto the center objective to give yourself some more board control. And with this pack specifically, the little nuanced bit is that the crates can be placed as one piece touching if you get more than one crate in your train set. So you can place them as a single piece with the crates touching, or you can place the crates separately, more than 4 inches apart, as individual pieces. So you get access to, if you get 2 crates in your train set, you have 2 places that you can generate, whatever the length of the crate is, plus 4 inches on each side of distance where there's just no cover. And that's going to be really tough for a melee army to deal with if you've got multiple crates in your kit.
Yeah, and another part of the terrain set within the mission pack, right, is that they just can't be placed vertically, right? So if you have a set of 3 crates, right, and you're going up against a non-flying, pretty infantry-centric, move forward, army, right? Like, crates don't have the breachable keyword, right? So you could put a crate next to a crate next to a crate horizontally on a line and create effectively a -X depending on the dimensions of the crate, move block, just using crates.
Yeah, you can make it really difficult for your opponent to get through a certain section of the board, or just open it up to be able to be shot and seen by all of your guns. The thing that you want to do, if you do have the opportunity to get some practice in, is you really just want to lay out what you want all of the boards to look like for your army before you get there. Depending on the layout and mission, you just want to have all of your terrain pieces pre-planned where they go for whatever matchup type you're going to be looking at. But with that not always being possible, the general rule is if you get the first drop, you probably want to put something on the middle objective, and whatever you put on the middle objective is going to be determined by if you're looking at, those questions that Don alluded to earlier. If you're the shooting army, crate, right? If you are a shooting army versus another shooting army, are they more or less shooting than you? Do you have the movement advantage? Are you going to need to turtle up a bit more? And that's going to kind of determine what you want to do a bit.
Yeah, it really just becomes a chess match between you and your opponent. And it really kind of shows, not necessarily, I think oftentimes, it's people refer to player placement as a skill, right? But I think the skill with terrain in mind is not necessarily where do I place it, right? Some of those fundamentals are easy to understand, right? But knowing the skill there is knowing how to leverage that terrain to what your army functionally will do on the table, and understanding what benefits you can derive from the different terrain within your set, going first or going second, knowing, okay, I went first, this is the type of terrain and the location of the terrain that I want to place, and vice versa, right? Like, it's more or less understanding how to leverage the terrain at your disposal, and then coupling that with what location is the most beneficial.
Yeah, what I find interesting also about this player pack is after you have that roll-off, if you get the defender, you get to pick which of the terrain groups that the table's been divided up into. And so this is kind of an unknown point for me where, I think you would hope and assume that, you're going to get mostly symmetrical sides, but I've never been to this location before. So, it could be that you rock up to a table and the judges divide them into two different piles of terrain, and one is just clearly better than the other.
Well, and clearly better could be differentiated by what your army and objectives are too, right? Like, you walk up and see one pile and go, this is the one I want, and I walk up and see both piles and think completely the opposite, right? But yeah, I do hesitate to say that they will be equivalent. In my experience up in the Kansas City scene, playing player placed, it has been pretty close to equivalent on each board. Now, each board compared to each other board might not be equivalent, right? But at least the piles of terrain on that particular table were equivalent. But this is big. This is potentially a 65 or something person event, right? Like,
I haven't looked to see how many people are on the roster.
It's sold out. We'll see how many drops we get.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a few folks. The other thing that you're going to have to be very cognizant of when you're placing your terrain is pre-measuring your movements for your units to get from terrain piece to terrain piece, and you're going to have to watch your angles. Angle play is going to become very important in this map pack because of the player place terrain. You're going to have to be very, very aware of what angles you're creating and what angles you are closing with where you place your pieces.
And I can tell you from experience, it's really easy to think that you've created a safe haven for yourself, and have not anticipated an extra 1-inch movement or what have you. And what you've really done is created a direct line of sight to your whole deployment zone, right? And you're doing that to yourself. And as most of us are not super experienced with throwing down terrain, it can happen real quick. So it's important not to just think about the piece that you're putting down right now, but how that interacts with everything else that you want to put down, and how all of that interacts with your game plan.
Yeah. Don, to answer your question, we're up to 80 people at this GT now.
Whew. Yeah, so there's definitely a potential for some variance in the terrain piles on a table.
Fielding 40 tables is no small feat. But while I got it fresh on the brain, like Don, you said something very, very important, and in between what you and Cox said as far as measuring how far your units can move, taking into account how far your opponent's stuff can use. And this is an underrated skill, I feel, in Warhammer. Like, understanding what your opponent's threat ranges are, right? If they can move 5 inches and they shoot 24 and they can't advance and shoot, you can stand 29.01 inches right in the open and be totally safe, right? Understanding those threat ranges, understanding kind of how your opponent wants to play that game, and then also taking into account I lost it. Like breaking up those sight lines, taking that little bit of extra time. Like, even if you run over and you're on a clock, even if you run over your allotted time to place terrain and you're using some of your game time, take that time, measure sight lines, ask those questions. Can you redeploy? Do you have a pre-game move? And you then need to take into account all of those questions pre-game, because Bryce will tell you from experience playing me, oh, I thought I was safe. I did not expect you to do X, and I forgot that you could do Y. Like, that being, I didn't think you could move that far. I didn't think that you could get that angle. Right? Take that extra time and have that conversation with your opponent at table side and go, hey, if you moved here, right, your max movement, and then if you have a laser pointer or draw a tape measure or have if you use yarn, whatever you use, and draw to that line of sight, have that conversation pregame with your opponent. If I place my model here, is there any way that you can shoot me?
What I really like about this is, I also really like to kind of go with what you're saying, Ward. They're doing something that at the only player placed event I went to before they didn't do, which is that this event is giving you 10 minutes of time with you and your opponent before the clock starts for the game. Like, they're factoring in pre-game actions and terrain placement. And I think if you were going into you're going into this weekend and you have a rough idea of what your army is going to be good at and how you would want to place your terrain, 10 minutes of time feels very generous that you can actually take that little bit of extra time to make those careful make those careful placements, right? Like, bust out that tape measure, bust out that laser, like, actually take the time to make sure you're putting something in a position that will benefit you and not just slapping down a piece of terrain because it's your turn.
Right, and that I feel is the difference between somebody that is a good 40K player that is making strides to becoming a very good, great 40K player. The more questions that you can ask pregame, the better that you can understand how your opponent's going to attack you, what their ranges are, what stratagems, whether that be redeploy or whatever, right? You're already taking into account how your opponent can affect your game, and then deploying whether that be deploying your terrain within the terrain setup or deploying your army in deployment itself, and taking in all that information and then making informed decisions. And another point on the 10-minute pregame, that's would make me think that this is almost a more user-friendly player place terrain packet, because I've never heard of there being like, that's always just been part of your however much allotted time. Like, having that extra 10 minutes is probably because there's 80 some odd people. I doubt all 80 of those people have a high volume of experience with player placed, and giving that little extra 10 minutes to think, measure, etc. That will give newer players to the terrain format a little bit extra time. Yeah, and that too.
Yeah. So I want to kind of go the other direction here for just a brief moment as we're talking learning the player place terrain and all of these questions that come up at the start of the game with this different to us terrain format. I caution against anybody taking an army that they're not pretty familiar with, right, in a game plan that they're not fairly confident in, or fairly confident at least in how it operates and their knowledge of that. Because there's so many there's such an increased number of decision points from the player place terrain, right? Like
it comes into like, as you're trying to build a list, as I like to think of it, it comes into trying to take away points of failure, right? Like things that you can choose to do that would make variance a less of an issue. So in what you're saying, like picking an army you know how to play well, that is going to try and help mitigate making like play mistakes.
Exactly. Decision paralysis is a very real thing, right? And it's super relevant in this game, and that every turn you've got 100 decisions to make, right? So if we can reduce those at any step in the way, I think that's great.
Yeah, I almost decided to bring Chaos Knights to this just for fun. I really did.
You monster! How dare you? We know in this chat, we know in private that you've played Chaos Knights at an RTT, but now this is going to go out into the world, and I'm going to message Joe from Wargames Live about it to put his people on you. Everyone's going to know that you've betrayed the Ultramarines, and now that's because of you. You've put that out there.
I mean, he's been kicking my ass with Chaos
really
Knights for about a year at this point.
As a player.
Well, when your practice partner's Cox, like, you get some pretty solid practice, but...
I mean, he's got a few practice games.
I'm just grateful that it's Chaos Knights, and we did not manage to convince you to pick up Tau. That would have just been a whole nother round of terrifying.
I don't even want to dream that nightmare.
Ooh.
You can paint him ultramarine blue.
And I asked Brent, I was like, hey, what about Chaos Knights? He literally said exactly what Don said. He goes, I would take Ultramarines. He goes, will I give you crap for it? Absolutely. He's like, I think it'd be more fun to see you playing Chaos Knights, but as far as familiarity with your army, understanding how that army interacts with terrain on an intimate level, because I have nearly 500...
We know you're intimate with your Ultramarines, Ward.
That's right. You're just going to have less fail points and less decision points that aren't just a kind of autopilot from the number of games I have with this.
Exactly. Your questions and decision points are with the terrain placements and all that. Like, it's not with how do I interact with X or Y.
Yeah,
you know
that's
that
exactly
already.
right.
Yeah. Like, for me, one of my things that I'm trying to take away as a fail point is by playing Iron Hands, I can kind of answer the question, am I the shooting army or not, when I rock up to a game. Most of the time, the answer will be yes. And so, because I won't have to think about that, I'm hoping that allows me to have the same game plan into most of the games, where I can be like, all right, I'm going first, crate right there on the middle.
And you guys are doing a wonderful job of covering how important that pregame conversation is. And the more times you have that conversation, the faster it's going to get and the more precise you'll get with the questions that you're asking. Instead of asking, what does that unit do, you start asking, what is your maximum threat range? What is the highest output of one of your shooting units? Things like that kind of give you an idea of what it is that you're looking at. Sometimes you walk up to a table and you play in the Brent Slam and you go, are you going to clock me, bro? Oh, did that joke just fall flat? Oh, man.
Bing, 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 bing. No, it didn't.
No, you need to...
Wah, wah.
No, you need to add in the curb your enthusiasm. So as we're kind of getting our minds around trying to go to this event, how do you guys feel like the best way to practice player place terrain is? Because I've gotten maybe 5 or so games practicing on, not all the missions yet, but most of them. And what I typically find is I'm more interested in trying to play out the terrain drop and the first 2 turns than I am trying to get full games of people.
I think that's absolutely the correct method, because you have to see the follow-through on where the terrain pieces are to understand how the game evolves from where the terrain is set.
I think there's some value to pursuing it down to 3 and 4 after you've got turns 1 and 2 kind of locked in. But if you can lock in turns 1 and 2, that's going to carry you through a majority of your games in many cases, right? Like, it's going to get you good solid footing to then figure it out as you go.
Well, and even if you can't grab a buddy and get down to the table and actually get some player placed reps, just grab Tabletop Simulator or whatever and just throw pieces of terrain on the board and practice moving your units by yourself. Just knowing how far your guys move and if you can make it from one terrain piece to the next terrain piece is going to be very important to understanding how you're going to be able to approach the board as you move into the game.
Yeah, for me, this will actually be an interesting experience. I likely won't have time to get a game outside of the RTT on the 20th. One, because I got some commission work, and then I have models myself that I'm trying to get painted for Midwest Conquest. But if, like Cox said, if you don't have TTS, if you can't rock up to a table and just understand what different terrain traits, right? And this is without knowing explicitly, this is what a set of the terrain looks like, which we don't have. If you had that, you could make far more, you can infer far more information having that. But without having that, right, just understanding, if I get 2 or 3 ruins, right, if I get 2 things of dense and a couple crates, how can I use those forests, right, to mitigate a shooting army's output, or to slow a melee army that doesn't ignore modifiers or whatever, to slow their movement, or to lengthen their charges, right? Just understanding what exact benefits that you can get from terrain and how to leverage those to your benefit, I think, outside of just actually practicing player plays is another good way to get
I love
practice.
that you mentioned slowing down melee armies with that word. Something I've seen in probably every event of player plays I've been to, at least in one of the games. Somebody has a forest, either in the middle, beginning, or the end of their drops, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this piece of crap, and they throw it in a corner where it's not going to affect anything the rest of the game, when they could have absolutely chucked it in between 2 critical points and slowed down my slow-moving bugs to prevent the onslaught of death, right? And that's crazy to me. And or you have leftover ruins that you don't know where to put it, and it's not going to provide you line of sight coverage anywhere, right? But you can set it behind your deployment zone because you're playing GSC, and now you have a secondary piece of obscuring that they can't just come in and shoot at you. They have to come in and be able to move 3 inches, right? You can do quirky little things like that depending on your matchup and what the mission is. They don't just throw a piece of terrain away.
Yeah, and every piece will give you some measure of benefit. Even if you're a shooting army, right? If you have access to rerolls, or if you have ways to mitigate stuff, or if you're going into a shooting versus shooting matchup, right? That dance, although it affects you, it might affect your opponent in a more negative way. So it's I would rather take the -1 to hit with my shooting weapons and have that defensive bonus also back with me, right? Or you can just use that as I think that my unit's durable enough that if at this range I can just deploy within this dense in the open. Sure, you're not benefiting from cover as far as a saving throw, but they're a little bit less efficient shooting you, and just understanding the trade-offs. I'll take a little bit of penalty in my movement, but I have a little bit more defensive stats against a shooting army, right? Like knowing those intricacies of the terrain traits and how to how to take advantage of those is a big deal.
Yeah, like understanding that bikes in cavalry can't breach terrain, right? Or that monsters can't, right? So like you can deploy a little bit more offensively with some of your weaker things if you're dealing with an army that's going to have to move forward and walk their butts around this 6-inch long piece of terrain, right? Or you can deploy a little bit more aggressively if you know that, yeah, you might be able to reach me with kind of a long bomb charge turn 1, but now it's going to be a 13-inch charge because of this piece of terrain that I'm sitting on. So I'm safe, right? Things like that.
So, go to YouTube, open up YouTube, put in War Games Live Warzone Atlanta for this year, and watch the first 20 minutes of all of John Lennon's games where they go through and actually place the terrain, and you will get a master class on how to use the terrain to your
Keeping
advantage.
in mind that Warzone Atlanta does have some intricacies to the way that they do player plays, but for the most part,
they've got some funky stuff that they do. But I mean, you just watching somebody who's really, really good at it go through the steps, and if you watch 3 of those games where he's actually doing it, you'll be able to draw some trends and take a look at how he's using the terrain to his advantage, the kinds of situations that he's trying to set up based on where he's putting his pieces. And that is a really good tool that is readily accessible to everyone, even if you don't have the time to get on the table or grab a buddy and get some practice in. Okay, well, I think that from a top down, that just about takes care of the easy way to at least get a handle on what it is that you're going to be looking at. It's not going to be easy. Once you get to the table, it's not going to be easy. But you just have to understand that it's your first time at player placed. Just try to learn from every interaction, try to learn from every game, and just get better at it as often as you can.
Yeah. So, in closing, I guess the only thing that I have for player place, if you don't get enough practice with it, take this as, and this is exactly how I'm going to look at it. I'm getting 5 probably very high quality practice games with player placed, regardless of the outcome, right? Like you need to have some type of specific terrain and have it mirrored. You'd like to have it mirrored, where you have like a symmetrical set of terrain. But if you don't have that, or you don't have access to somebody locally to get like a ton of games of player place, like look at this as an opportunity to get 5 GT at this point major level games under your belt using player placed.
I think just know what your army does, know if you are the shooting army in this matchup or not, and know what you're going to need. Know where you're going to need your things placed to stage is the only thing I can say to summarize this whole thing.
Yeah, and I think similar to kind of what Ward said, and tying in to what Bryce said, if this is your first player placed event, go to it looking to learn. Playing player placed and really understanding the terrain, like it provides you with a whole new perspective on how this game functions and how these different aspects interact with each other, and you can really learn a tremendous amount about how your army interacts with terrain and about how terrain interacts with each other and the mission, right? And really how you can utilize that terrain to your advantage in any player format, right? So that's what I would kind of focus on.
Okay. And thank you all for sticking with us through this very extended episode of the Core Keyword Podcast this week. But this is the first one this is the one that we were really excited to do. This is the content that we're here for, and we appreciate you for sticking with us through it. So, at this point, Don, hit the outro music.
Magnets did nothing wrong.